So I'll start again from a slightly different point of view and ask a question just generally, that is, what is prayer? So there are several types of prayer. When we feel that we need some assistance, some help, this is one form of prayer. And after all, if the object of our devotion is this divine entity that can solve all problems and that can assist us in every way, regardless, whether it is small or whether it is big, then we should surely have confidence that this entity will help us. In Jesus' language, if a child asks the father for a piece of bread, he won't give a stone. What's the point of that? It's not a cruel and malicious entity. But you see, the whole key to devotion is personal devotion. That is, that we have to expose our heart. It's a heart to heart. And heart means receiving and also giving. So we're receiving divine grace, and we're having faith and trust in that. But at the same time, we're giving the full devotion of our heart. And that means surrender. When Swami Shivananda, that is Mahapurush Maharaj, that is a disciple of Ramakrishna, wrote letters, he always put, I surrender, surrender to Sri Ramakrishna in this case. So the sense of surrender needs to be there. And therefore this concept that we have is not distant. And he who came as Jesus, if we understand this incarnation principle, he who came as Jesus, he who came as Buddha, he who came as Krishna and Ram and so on and so forth, came as Ramakrishna. And this is very similar to Ramakrishna's own words that he used to Swami Vivekananda. He who came as Krishna, who came as Rama, is here now as Ramakrishna. Now, to verify that, he would have highlighted some of his devotees, like Swami Akhanandananda, as disciples of Jesus. So when we talk about Jesus and Buddha and all these, we are talking of historical figures, no doubt, but we're also talking of timeless entities. We're talking of a cosmic mind. When we say that he or she is a son or a daughter of God, what we are saying is that it is that word, it is that expression, it is that first cosmic creative impulse which is there. So when we pray to our chosen ideal, that chosen ideal is right here, right now, intimately there, and is responsible for your breathing and responsible for all your thoughts, well, thought current anyway, and is responsible for the investment that we call my life. So that we have to be convinced of, so that when we start our meditation, we start with a spirit of humility and surrender. And what I say really is that in the morning meditation, you are preparing for the day. You're setting it up, just as the sun, when it rises, is setting itself up for the illumination of the whole day. And then the evening meditation will be a recap, will be reflection, what happened in the day, and a resolve that tomorrow will be good and better, and that we can now surrender ourselves into the relaxation of night and be held in the divine arms. You see, my language is a little poetic, and we have to use poetry and art and all of that in order to get a clear idea, in order to mobilize the heart, actually. Now, I'm going to include in what I have to say something about Swami Akhanandananda, because we are celebrating his birthday today. And so it would be appropriate to say a few things about that. And why would we do it? Why would we celebrate any saint's birthday? It would be because these beings act as a model. Ramakrishna acts as the highest model we can think of, in his own words, having done the 16 annas, the 16 parts, the Indian money divided like that. We but have to probably do one or two. And so we can see a central light there, and all these offshoots, all these other candles or lamps, if you will, these great giants of personalities which were disciples. And we can learn from their progression, their human progression, just as our own human progression is that we can see that there is some fellow being who is not perfect, such as Swami Akhanandananda and all the other disciples, teachers, and so on. Every saint was originally a sinner at some point. And we can therefore see how they managed to elevate themselves in the light of provision of divine grace that they managed to access, because that divine grace was flowing naturally toward them. Well, Swami Akhanandananda, he grew up very orthodox. Now, some people have that benefit that they grew up, in our view, because maybe of experience or previous incarnation, they were born naturally spiritual. Now, that's a good thing as a foundation. But on the other hand, if it's orthodox, if it exhibits orthodoxy, then maybe it's restrictive. So just to give you some idea, and I'm using a book, I'm using two books here. One is called God Lived With Him, Life Stories of 16 Monastic Disciples of Sri Ramakrishna by Swami Akhanandananda. A personally autographed copy of his book is here. And and the other one is The Disciples of Ramakrishna, previously published as Apostles, which he also gives the teachings. I'm going to use both books. The first one is a bit more detailed, but once I've read a bit of the detail, I'll put it aside and resort to the other one. So he used to bathe 4 times a day. It wasn't because he got dirty 4 times a day. It was because it was an orthodox religious ritual. And as a result, his skin and hair became very dry. He was vegetarian, no problem with that. He cooked his own food. And he had the habit of chewing a mirablan, Balanian, and cooked his own food. He had the habit of chewing a kind of bitter nut after meals, and his lips became white and so on and so forth. He used to practice pranayama just as a boy, along with other morning and evening spiritual disciplines. And he increased the volume of this practice so much that his body began to perspire and shiver. And anyway, this was kind of the background of the boy. Now, remarkably, he meets Ramakrishna, and Ramakrishna says, "Oh, you should meet Naran." That was the later Swami Vivekananda. He doesn't have any of these practices. In other words, what he's saying to him is that all this orthodoxy is maybe not so good for you. You should loosen up a little bit. So he encourages him to visit Naran, and immediately he becomes fascinated with him, and he understands what Ramakrishna means. So I'm going back here to his encounter there with Naran. He says about Naran, Ramakrishna says this: "Look at Naran, he has such prominent eyes. He chews 100 betel rolls a day and eats whatever he gets. But his mind is deeply introspective. That's the important thing." I'm going to pause there, relating to your question. We'll pick up your question as we go on also. And that is, you see, we have to remind ourselves that our spiritual practice has to be deeply introspective. And by spiritual practice, I mean even outside of formal meditation and prayer and japa, but in our daily life, we have to momentarily pause throughout the day, whenever we can, and stay in that poised internal area, that central aspect within us, which is all stillness, just for a while. That creates a kind of stability for the next part of our day. Anyway, continuing, he says, he goes along the streets of Kolkata, seeing houses and chattels, horses and carriages, and everything as full of God. Therein is a wonderful key to spiritual life. It is full of God. When we look at the various objects and encounters in our daily life, we sometimes don't see that. I think more than often we don't see that. But it's not just God is in there. It's full of it, full of God, overflowing, full of God. The very movement is like that. Now, in the Hindu festival calendar, we're about to enter a very auspicious period of Navaratri. It is the one moment of the year and the one religion which from most ancient times has decided that at least in a few months, or at least in part of the year, particularly the autumn, which has its own beauty and change, we can see it as a kind of Mother Nature dressing herself up in browns and reds and oranges, the autumn colors. And that this is pure Shakti. The whole of nature is vibrating with this. And for good or bad, there's no good or bad in nature. We can see it in different ways, different contrasting things. But everything in the entire universe, regardless of how small or how big or how grand, is just a variated manifestation of this divine energy that's moving, fighting the forces that are stopping progression toward goodness, and providing all the resources necessary, but also Mahamaya, the one who is operating this appearance and this delusion and this play. And you know, in a drama, the actors who play the villains or who play the heroes or heroines are not themselves heroes or heroines. They are not villains in their personal life. They are simply actors playing a part. When we take this life so seriously, rather than this joyful play of our Divine Mother, who is Mahamaya, the great, great deceiver Maya, is also a Ravila, because she comprises these three evolutionary forces of nature, three components of nature. These gunas, these binding forces of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, and she alone knows you're not bound at all. You're always ever free. But I'm giving you the illusion that you're bound. Well, is the mother being cruel, giving us suffering like that? Well, no, because she's also giving us the opportunity to escape from this illusion. What a wonderful thing. In terms of how he developed, he was a great traveler. Once Ramakrishna had passed away, the monks gathered at Baranagar, but he never did. Swami Akhanandananda, he went off exploring, and he went off to Tibet and the Himalayas. He was a great traveler, and he was well versed in these regions, in these mountain regions. He was a great authority actually on Tibet. And of course it became fashionable in the 20th century that all knowledge comes from Tibet. There's a verse that he had written in the Advaita ashram in Mayavati, and he asked for the wording of a Sanskrit couplet that appeared in a certain edition of the Prabhupada Bharata, the magazine, in 1927. And the article was entitled Neo-Hinduism, and it ran as follows. I do not covet earthly kingdom or heaven or even salvation. Now, you see, when we pray, sometimes we are praying for the equivalent of an earthly kingdom, that is, some earthly benefit, or we're praying for some afterlife benefit, a heaven, or maybe we're praying for salvation of some kind. He's saying, in this couplet, I don't pray for any of these things. The only thing I desire is the removal of the miseries of the afflicted. The idea expressed in the couplet was so much, you see, after the Swami's heart, that even after the lapse of, let's say, about 10 years on the eve of his departure from this world, he wanted to know its precise reading. And once he knew that, Swami Akhanandananda then entered into the Mahasamadhi. He was age 72, relatively young in these modern days, but in those days fairly old. And he wanted to pass away at Belur Math. What was the expression of his heart? Don't forget, all spirituality really is heart to heart. It is the heart opening up and expressing itself. And he understood Swami Vivekananda's central theme about going to the West. So moved was he with the poverty, the ignorance, the lack of education, the misery, the suffering of his countrymen there in India, that he resolved, I will raise funds in the West for the upliftment of the suffering masses. And it was Akhanandananda who understood that. After, let's say, about 4 years of wandering, he came back to the monastery where his brothers were. He took his monastic vows. But again, he traveled away. But during his travels, he himself also witnessed this horrendous suffering. And in spiritual life, we do wish to wander away and seek our own solace. And so it was natural that the early disciples of Ramakrishna went away with a kind of wanderlust and with the idea that I don't really wish to meet people. I can travel to some extent with my brothers. And so it was that he, Swami Vivekananda and Akhanandanandaji, would have set off, and they would have gone separate ways, and they would have tried to meet up, and they would have failed. But overall, it really was the central message of Vivekananda that Akhanandananda caught hold of. He ended up in his travels in Khetri. Now, the Maharaj of Khetri was a great, great disciple of Swami Vivekananda, and he recovered some health there. That is, Swami Akhanandananda recovered some health there. But he saw the need for education, and he started a school and got the Maharaj to sponsor it, and persuaded the Maharaj to drop the habit. You see, this durbar where people can ask things, they have exposure to the Maharaja. But the lower castes were not permitted, the poorer people were not permitted anywhere near. He lifted that. He persuaded him to lift that. So it was that he opened a school and sponsored it, invested himself in this great education for everybody. And it was in Udaipur, actually, while he was wandering there in Rajasthan. Khetri is in Rajasthan. And he was much pained to see the condition, even of the tribal people, the Bills. They were the Aboriginal inhabitants of that place. And with the help of a friend, he had them sumptuously fed one day. And he also took great pains to start a Middle English school and founded at Alwar and other places of Rajputana a number of societies which regularly discussed useful social, religious, and educational topics. And finally, he left that place and he returned in the end of 1895 to the monastery, which had then relocated to Alambasar. But he was never really idle, not looking after his own salvation. And sometimes the Hindu mystics and what have you, and saints and holy people are accused of looking after their own salvation, and that's it. But you see, that's not true. And it wasn't a novel idea from Swami Vivekananda. In fact, in the Bhagavad Gita in the 5th chapter, and I pointed this out the other day, there is this phrase, Sarva Bhutahite Rataha. Rataha, that is welfare of all beings. Once you have destroyed all your ignorance, refined your mind a little bit, removed all the sins, and removed doubts, and once your senses are nicely controlled, you should then be devoted to the welfare of all beings, is the phrase. The rishis attain absorption in Brahman, but you see, in between that, dedicated to the welfare of all beings. It's not a novel idea. It's not something introduced into India by Christian missionaries, even though they may claim it. There is a social responsibility. Now, bear in mind, of course, that the ancient social structure was that the royalty, that is the kings and the princes and so on and so forth, would have taken care of all the social needs, poverty and education and so on and so forth. But, once all the Maharajas and so on and so forth had gone, or the British had taught them, hey, you're a king, you should be hunting tigers. That's what kings do, and enjoying the luxury of your position, ruining essentially the royal structure, then of course, who would do it? It has to be this new order of sannyasins that Swami Vivekananda created, that would look after famine, that would look after educational needs, that would provide all the needs for everybody, regardless of who they are. He was, for example, in a certain district, Murshidabad, and he met there a poor Mohammedan girl, weeping. She had broken her pitcher, her pitcher for water, and it was the only one in the family. That was the level of her poverty. There was no means to replace it, no money even. And the Swami had only 4 annas with him, and he bought a pitcher from a shop for the girl and gave her half an anna worth of popped rice to eat along with it. And while he was resting there were a dozen emaciated old women in rags. They surrounded him for some food, and he immediately spent his little balance that he had in purchasing some food for them. And shortly after this, he came to learn that a famished old woman was lying sick and helpless in that village. And at once, without hesitation, he went there and did what he could to help her. And that was his first contact with the very famous famine. The further he proceeded, the more frightful spectacles he met, until at a certain place he cried halt. And he resolved, in this place called Mahola, not to move from the place until he had relieved the famine-stricken people. And so he wrote to the monastery in Lambasar, asking for help. And Swami Vivekananda, who had returned to India by that time, about, let's say, 3 months before, dispatched 2 of the monks with some money to where he was. And so it was the 15th of May, 1897, that the first famine relief work of the entire Ramakrishna mission was inaugurated in that place, and other centers also. And that in that place it lasted for about a full year. And then, of course, in the course of all of that, Swami Akhanandananda had to take charge of 2 orphans. And the idea then he had, let me found an orphanage. There are many more like this. And so with the encouragement from the district officers of the area, the Swami, after taking temporary care of a number of orphans, he founded an orphanage in 1898. And the orphanage was called Ramakrishna Ashram, which was then removed shortly after to a rented house at Sargachi. And after continuing there, he continued there for some 13 years. Then the ashram was moved to its own premises in the same village. And that's where it is now since March 1913. Now, Swami Akhanandananda, after the passing away of Mahapurush Maharaj, Swami Shivananda, he was elected as the president, even in his old age, but he has still had a soft spot for Sargachi, and so he spent his time between Bilumat and Sargachi, and again looking after the orphan boys and so on and so forth, and the people there. And so from the foundation of that institution to the last days of his life, he gave his best attention on its improvement. And it saved a good number of orphan boys from starvation. Not only starvation, but illiteracy and degradation. And many of these were put in a position to earn an honest living. And under the Swami's supervision, the ashram also conducted during those years a day and night school for the village boys and adults, and an outdoor dispensary, which afterwards developed considerably and treated thousands upon thousands of sick people every year. For about 10 years, from 1900 to 1910, the ashram ran a vocational school teaching weaving, sewing, carpentry, and sericulture. These handicrafts turned out by its boys won first prizes for several successive years at the Banjitya Industrial Exhibition organized by the Maharaja Manindra Chandra Nandi, who, by the way, was a staunch patron of this institution. And unfortunately, for want of accommodation, the school had to ultimately be discontinued. But the Swami not only attended to the general education of the ashram boys, but also paid due regard to their spiritual training. After all, the difficulty of the education today, and Swami Vivekananda's vision was very clear about it, is that there has to be some character building. You give a student tools enough to earn a living, but you have to cater for a wider range of interests. The person has to learn to be a good citizenship and have a steady, stable character. And that was very important. Otherwise, what's the use of much learning unless you have that benefit? Anyway, he taught in these institutions, therefore, chanting, prayers, morning and evening, and select passages from the sacred books, like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and they were read and they were explained to them. And orphans were admitted to the ashram without any distinction of caste or creed. So that means that a few Muslim boys were also maintained at the ashram for several years, and they were trained so that they might develop faith in their own religion. That's very important. Sometimes we think that when we teach Vedanta, we're teaching cultural Hinduism. Well, we have to look at these pioneers to see the way. Not to change a person's religion, but to entrench them in the foundation of their own religion. I was attending an interfaith conference over some 3 days last week, and I was invited to Birmingham by a Muslim lady, and I said, oh, good, I will talk about Islam and the beauty of Islam. She was delighted. Because our ideal, to quote Swami Akhanandananda, is to make a Muslim a better Muslim, a Christian a better Christian, a Hindu a better Hindu, a humanist a better humanist, etc. I'm embellishing the examples. But that's it, not to change a person from what is precious to them, not only culturally but religiously. There's depth in every religion when you go to its depth. How do we know this? We know this because Ramakrishna firsthand experienced it. He experienced all the avenues within Hinduism, which are so many bhavas, including ultimately this non-dualism itself, from this great monk, this great abbot, Totupuri. And there experiencing Nirvikalpa Samadhi itself, the very height. And that is why when we worship somebody who has entered into this Nirvikalpa Samadhi of a very unusual temperament, we can accept this entity as the guiding light of our life. And we have to avoid the trap of saying this was something unique. One person having attained it, we can all attain it. We just have to work out what is the machinery, what is the point of view, the way of thinking. And although we're talking about a male saint here, there are hundreds, thousands of female saints also, whose life is just the epitome of perfection. And we also see in their life the humanity as well. It's not that they were born perfect. It's that they arranged this perfection through steady practice. But what was necessary? In the case of Swami Akhanandananda, this meeting and connection with Ramakrishna, who always used to say to these young aspiring boys, "Come again." He really meant it. He said, "I really wish that you come again." And on the first day of his meeting, Ramakrishna said, "Please stay the night," and he did. So now imagine staying in the premises of this wonderful temple dedicated to the Divine Mother Kali, with its great, great atmosphere. It's a place of pilgrimage. It's a sacred place. And there, this great Paramahansa is there living. Not only living, but prepared to guide the individual, the young boy, in his life. And he would have done it with a great deal of fun. One thing that is mentioned in the life of Swami Akhanandananda would be his tremendous sense of humor. Of course, when the love with which the children of Sri Ramakrishna bore towards each other is said to be indescribable. And Swami Akhanandananda was the favorite of all. And Swami Vivekananda loved him particularly and affectionately addressed him Ganges, that is the English equivalent for Ganga. But he didn't, on that account, spare the young Swami when it came to indulging in practical jokes. The master himself was a great lover of fun and used it as an effective means of imparting spirituality. And all his disciples shared this attitude towards life. Even if the joke was at one another's expense, it endeared them all the more to one another. Now a small comment. If we have a historical ideal, chosen ideal, let us take, for example, Ramakrishna, or let us take Jesus. Last night, I gave a guided meditation. It was actually centered on Jesus. It could equally have been Ramakrishna, or it could equally have been Buddha. We have to really find out how this person walked. What did they say? How did their face shine? And this becomes an object of our contemplation. And to actually make that so real, internalizing it, that we have a real dialogue, a real conversation with Ramakrishna. It's not a fantasy. It is a real encounter. Once we open up, we'll feel there's a real person there, a real presence there. Some people experience this in an unusual way as a vision. But there's a real intimate presence there once we open the heart and feel the divine presence there. And then prayer becomes a listening thing. We become a recipient of a flow of inner wisdom that comes to us. And that enriches us tremendously. You know, when we access that, we are accessing joy. And compared to all the various joys in the world has to offer, there's nothing that compares to that intimate joy. Or even the joy of helping somebody with the idea that we are worshipping. Anyway, you see, after his assumption, that is Swami Akhanandananda, of the presidential office, Swami Akhanandananda was called upon to initiate disciples. And though he showed reluctance at first, perhaps out of humility, don't forget this was a man who himself personally worked, using his hands, using everything at his disposal, getting his hands dirty, as it were, in the actual work in Sargachi. Anyway, he soon overcame the scruple, fortunately, and during the last 3 years, he blessed a good many earnest seekers of both male and female, and he insisted on their observing a high standard of purity and moral excellence in their everyday life. About a year before his death, he had a premonition of the approaching end and told some of his disciples about it. And with this in view, he arranged the recital of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in his presence. And quite near the end, he expressed his desire to celebrate Vashanti Puja, that is the vernal worship of the Divine Mother Durga at the ashram. And that is more than coincidence that we are reading this out, because we're entering into this era of Durga Puja. But knowing that 2 of his predecessors had had that desire and passed away without seeing the ceremony performed, he had misgivings about his own case too, and expressed himself to that effect. He had a shed erected for this purpose and said to the ashram workers, well, if I don't live to see the worship, at least I have the satisfaction of raising this mandapa for the mother. You will do the rest. Like the independent man that he was, he often dismissed the idea of suffering long on his deathbed, and chafing under the infirmities of old age as he was, and at having to accept through sheer necessity the loving services of his attendants, he would occasionally declare that he sometimes had a mind to break away from these ties and wander alone away from the haunts of people. Of course, he always loved Sargachi dearly. He never liked to be away from it for very long, if he could help. But it was a cherished desire of his to give up the body, not there, but at the sacred Belu Mat, the place that was sanctified with 1,001 memories of his beloved brother disciples, from the great Swami Vivekananda downwards. This wish of his was providentially fulfilled, since he was taken to Kolkata for better medical treatment. And a couple of days before his passing away, that is a month earlier, he had written to the Advaita Ashram asking for the wording of what I have just read out, because this was him completely. Just to remind you, the passage reads, I do not covet earthly kingdom or heaven or even salvation. The only thing I desire is the removal of the miseries of the afflicted. The idea expressed in the couplet was really so much after the Swami's heart. Now for the personality, what about the teachings? So we have a nice assembly of his teachings. Now you may say, how can his teachings be any different from the central teachings that are contained in the Upanishads and so on? Well, it's the same, of course, but It is always presented in a unique way, according to the teacher. But one thing that he said is that the Upanishad declares that those who do not try to know the self, that is the divine self, are killers of the self. A life is well spent if it is dedicated to the quest of the self. But what is that self? One has to hear about the self first, then think of it, and then meditate on it. That's the process of our study. Even now, we should take up a book on a regular basis every day, and we should use that process of reading it a little bit and then reflecting on it, even a small passage, and then meditating on it. When people come here to the ashram, some people come here for a whole day, like on a Sunday or a Saturday, and they come here knowing that I will sit down with them and study. And I tell them, pick any book from here, and they pick a book, and I say, open it at random, and it is always the right place for them. And they read a passage and we explore it. We may explore it for several hours and reflect on it until we find the inner meaning of it. And then we bring it up into the meditation. Yajnavalkya, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there's a section which is the Yajnavalkya section. He told Maitreyi that the self is the dearest of all, and all else is dear for the sake of the self. It's the self alone that exists and nothing else besides. Everything springs out of the self and everything is in the self. The self resides in all, though it may be asleep in some. We have to understand that the Ishta Devata that we select as our most beloved is also our greatest teacher. Studying the things that that person said, studying the way they conducted their life, their whole personality, getting infused with the understanding of it, so that we really can relate in a personal way to that. And so the attempt is always going on in everybody to express that self. And that is what constitutes spiritual practice. In fact, whatever you do is a sort of spiritual practice, be it conscious or be it unconscious. And when that self will be realized, one will find it present everywhere, and that is one's highest achievement. And you may add that was the basis of his upliftment of the orphans and the poor and the uneducated and so on. One's purpose of life is to attain that state. We often miss that, you see, getting bogged down in small issues. What happened here, what happened there, what somebody said here, what somebody said there. And we get bogged down in that, missing the understanding, well, wait, I should reject anything which is not directing me in my spiritual life. Everyone must actualize that experience in life, for that is one's real nature. We should never think, I can't have it. We should never think, I am weak. Whenever any dejection sets in, remember that saying of the Lord in the Gita, yield not to unmanliness, that means weakness. There's no other path but to call on Him, he says. As though one's very life is in imminent danger. Always pray, Lord, please reveal yourself, please show yourself to me. That should be our central prayer. I want nothing else, not even heavenly joys. I want you only. And along with this, one has to pray, Lord, remove from me all hankering for enjoyment. Spiritual progress is a far cry in the midst of selfishness and narrow-mindedness. And when we sit down and maybe kind of examine our conscience a little bit at the end of a day, we can see how many activities were really to do with our own selfishness or our own narrow-mindedness. He says the spiritual path for the present age lies through the harmony of all the paths of the earlier ages. Now, what he means by that is In the very earliest of age, what we call the Satya Yuga, the ancient sages would have followed the path of jnana, that is the path of knowledge, the path of discernment. But in this age, we have to incorporate all of those things, that is, harmony of knowledge, the harmony of devotion, and the harmony of selfless work. And by selfless work, we mean all work, actually, that does not have a selfish component. Even ordinary work, so-called, can have that selfish component by attending to the work that is happening right here and right now, with all of your input, your energy input, and dedicating it to one's beloved. We must all of these, and it won't do to have only one. Anybody who's confused about this yoga or that yoga, should we engage in jnana yoga or bhakti yoga and so on and so forth? Very clear that Swami Vivekananda, and very clear that his master held to this harmony of methods. He says, the more you take care of yourself alone, the smaller you grow, and the more you think of others as yourself, the bigger you become. And then he quotes Swamiji, that is Swami Vivekananda. The happiness one derives by thinking of oneself becomes doubly multiplied when one thinks of somebody else, sharing equally in one's own happiness or unhappiness. The more you practice in that way, the more yourself spreads over the world, and then only can self-knowledge dawn. And the more you can think of others as yourself, the more loving your heart becomes, and the more is self-knowledge revealed. Then he talks about a very important thing. Japa is possible at all times. Japa is possible at all times. The Lord's name can be mentally repeated ever and anon. You can undertake japa any time you like. The master used to say that the bird sings the Lord's name as it flies even. Be quite sincere and straightforward, and never be crooked. Your heart will expand along with your sincerity and straightforwardness. Be always open and above board in all your dealings. Never play hide and seek. Straightforwardness is a great virtue. A man's heart is pure in proportion as he is open in his behavior. Try always to have a pure mind and holy thoughts, and also physical cleanliness. These are some of the teachings, the great teachings of Swami Akhanandananda. They're contained in, well, the latest book would be, the edition of it would be The Disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, compiled and edited by the famous Swami Gambirananda. And the other book I was referring to is this book, God Lived With Him. And there's a companion book, of course, They Lived With God, compiled by Swami Chetananda, who visited Ireland some while ago, quite a while ago, and we hosted him, or I hosted him, and took him to Dungannon, and he contributed his books to the library there in Dungannon. So we won't exactly finish off now, because I have to come back to the original question. I had to combine these two things and ask Porrick whether he was okay with that answer or whether he requires something more.
Yeah, I'm very happy with the answer. I think I need to go away and reflect, because it was just that idea of slipping back into old habits and old ways that didn't serve me very well. And I just wondered where that came from. So I'm glad I could ask the question, and I'm glad you've given me...
But you answered the question by saying old ways.
Yes. Yeah. Old ways, old habits.
Yes, and that's okay. Habits die hard. You see, the religious upbringing is very well entrenched. But it keeps us in many ways. It was useful in the past, but We have to outgrow some
Yeah.
outdated concepts,
Yeah.
and be careful about that. And the main thing is to create an intimacy, a reality and an intimacy with our object of worship, knowing that it is a living and entity that has invested life energy in you for a purpose. And that, if that's not a definition of love, I don't know what is.
Yeah. So true. So thank you very much.
All right, all good. Well, we'll leave it there. All right. Then, if there's no question, we'll leave it there. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Om